thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Paul from Shift Care. I'm now an operations manager and a customer experience manager. And I am very pleased to have our friends from Effective HR joining us again today. We've got Corinne and Emma, and I think Emma's running us through this in depth, and I'm sure lots of questions will be coming through. So yeah, really excited. We all love to talk about SCHADS. So yeah, over to you guys.
Amazing. Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for our part 2 of our SCHADS Award webinar series in collaboration with Shift Care. We're very glad to have you with us again as we continue to explore the complexities of this award and, of course, how to manage them confidently. Earlier this year, we covered some of the foundational elements of the SCHADS Award and the importance of proactive compliance. And today we're diving deeper into the more advanced and often misunderstood aspects of the award, especially those that create operational headaches if not managed properly. As always, our aim is to cut through the complexity and to give you practical guidance that supports compliance, reduces risk, and makes managing your workforce that little bit easier. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all meet today. I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us in today's webinar, and to elders past, present, and emerging. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. So I'm Emma. I'm a HR consultant at Effective HR, and I'm joined again by my colleague Corinne, lead HR consultant. Together, we bring substantial experience supporting businesses across HR, work health and safety, payroll, and navigating the ever-changing SCHADS Awards. In today's session, we'll focus on the key areas where we see SCHADS Award breaches most often occur. We'll begin by exploring award coverage, looking at the differences between the SCHADS Award and the Health Professionals Award, and the common trap of misclassification. We'll then take a closer look at pay structures, including how to pay salaries, flat rates, individual flexibility agreements, along with the risk of stepping outside the standard hourly rates. From there, we'll move into employee benefits and allowances, covering entitlements such as leave, clothing and equipment, first aid, travel, how to properly manage broken shifts, and we'll finish up with rostering complexities. As always, we will be doing an interactive Q&A session, so feel free to submit your questions via the chat at any time throughout the session, or alternatively use the QR code to book in a complimentary consultation with a HR consultant. I'll hand it over now to Corinne, who will take us through the technical content.
Amazing. Thank you, Emma. By way of recap, in our SCHADS Basics webinar, you can find on the Shift Care website, we speak around understanding how predominantly the home care and the SAC stream apply to NDIS providers and those covered by the SCHADS Award. So the key takeouts when we look at that basics information is that when we're looking to apply stream, we're applying it to the business and the organisation holistically, so as a whole. We want to then be reviewing the classification schedules for that particular stream at the back of the award to really understand how those classifications apply on an individual level. To get that final piece of the classification puzzle, we look at pay points and whether or not someone's going to be a shift worker or a day worker, because that can affect someone's rate of pay and business wage compliance matters. So you can catch up on that information by listening to the recording available. But today is a SCHADS Advanced Insights for a reason. So we're going to be looking at more technical elements of award coverage and other key complex scenarios we see pop up in this SCHADS and NDIS space. I've got an interesting scenario on the screen to get your brains thinking today, get into the swing of things. We've got Jamie, who's an elderly client. Jamie works with an elderly client in their home, providing companionship and assisting with personal care 3 days a week. On that 4th day, they do a social outing for multiple clients. Now, I see scenarios like this pop up all the time. What I often hear is people go, okay, because they're in the home on this particular days and then they're out in the community in this days, they're going to transfer to SACs. They absolutely are not going to do something like that. What's important, remember, I've given you a bit of a bum steer here talking about Jamie specifically. In order to work out where we put Jamie in accordance with the award, we need to start by looking at the business, the services that we're operating, to determine which stream may apply to Jamie's employment. So it is very nuanced, the key takeout being, and to be looking at that on a case-by-case basis. Get some advice in writing to make sure that you're comfortable applying the right stream. And we'll look at the so what as to why that matters in a little moment as well. Pardon me. But another point that I see come up all the time is looking at this very fine line and potential crossover between using that SCHADS award and using the Health Professionals Award when we are covering health professionals such as social workers, OTs, psychologists, those providers that are providing that more holistic and allied health services in that NDIS space. What we see in these awards is they both have coverage for health professionals, such as a social worker. So the example I've got on the screen at the moment, let's look at where this line starts and stops specifically. We've got Lisa, who's a qualified social worker working in a disability support organisation. She provides social work services, but also assists in social programs and case management. What award applies? Can she be covered by both? And what are the risks? Now, this is something, and as you will very quickly learn, we are nerds at Effective HR. We love this stuff. We regularly have the Fair Work Ombudsman directly on speed dial to talk these matters out to make sure that we're giving comprehensive and compliant advice. So this is one that I have spoken personally with the Ombudsman on to look at award coverage, because as I said, both awards do cover, in this particular scenario, a social worker. So in terms of, you know, what they say and where this is going to fall, long story short, we're going to be looking specifically at the SCHADS award for this one. And the reason for that is because when we think back to what does the business do, the business is in disability support. Okay, so while we have coverage under an industry award, we're not going to look outside that at an alternate award. So that's a bit of a technical process in going through award coverage there. What we can see in Schedule B in that SACS stream, we have coverage for a social worker that may be having certificates 3 and 4 or diploma in social work. It may also cover people with a degree. Okay, so there's plenty of coverage there. So to answer the question of whether Lisa or any employee in this scenario could be covered by both awards, no. Not really going to be something that we'd apply here, and there's risk associated with that. We often see this scenario as well pop up in this line between the SCHADS award and, for our administration employees, our clerks award. So looking at those clerical office-based roles. I quite often see people looking and putting your accounts people, your payroll officers, you know, any kind of office clerks covered under the Clerks Award, but we really need to double check that one. So add that to our checklist today if you're using that award. The reason why is, again, we're always starting at that industry level, that SCHADS award. So in the hypothetical example, we're talking about the SACS stream. There is plenty of coverage for clerical and administration employees there. There is limited, very limited coverage under the home care stream, so that very much needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. It's only if there's not coverage we would then potentially look at applying the Clerks Award. So I mentioned before, this one is super important. And so for me, the so what factor of why is this technical, nerdy exercise of determining award coverage and classification levels, why is it so important to have this recorded and implemented properly in your business? The biggest issue I see is misclassification essentially means you're going to be paying someone wrong. Be it an overpayment or an underpayment, it's wrong and it sucks on both levels for you. So when I say it's wrong, what that means, you know, if we take that example of the Health Professionals Award, the Health Professionals Award doesn't have shift structures for sleepovers, for excursions, all of those sorts of things that mean that the way that you're structuring your roster might need to change depending on what the award provisions say. So it's really important that we have that information clear, that we're rostering and paying our employees correctly to make sure that we're avoiding those wage compliance issues of overpayment or underpayment, which is now attracting criminal sanctions and hefty fines for wage theft. So very important to differentiate there as well. We did speak about pay point progression in our SCHADS basic webinar, but we're not here for the basics. So we are going to talk some case law. So get ready to nerd out with me. What I have on the screen now specifically is around a bit of a paraphrase to take out from clause 13.3 of the SCHADS award that tells us when employees are eligible to move between pay points. This is something that I do see a lot of confusion around. So we did have a recent case, the case is called Thomas and Arvius Limited, that provided more guidance on how to interpret the clause of this award. So what the court indicated here is to say that clause 13.3 of the SCHADS award is not designed to operate as an automatic entitlement to progression. Okay, it's designed that when they've demonstrated that competency with those new or enhanced skills, they become eligible. So again, that key word is eligible, not entitled, for possible progression. It goes on to confirm that the decision of whether or not someone will progress is at the discretion of the employer. So a specific quote from the judge here is to say, properly construed, this clause of the modern award does not create an automatic entitlement to progress from one pay point to another, clearly because just because the criteria is satisfied. So for me, it's really important, and you would have remembered we say, look, we can't have our cake and eat it too. That clause doesn't mean, and that case does not mean that we can just ignore it altogether. Go, oh no, it's my discretion, I'm not putting you up. Okay. To demonstrate compliance, we want to systemize how we are making decisions around who goes up and who stays the same when it comes to pay point progression. While the award compliance itself is telling us, okay, maybe not everyone has to go up depending on the circumstances, I look at other peripheral risks around this. So if we're putting one support worker up and one staying the same, is there potentially protected grounds or characteristics that mean that employee may make a general protections claim based on being withheld from a pay point? So really important that we're systemizing this process, not only to demonstrate compliance with the clause, but equally to mitigate risk. You know, those hidden discrimination risks that are becoming more and more apparent, especially in this industry, is super important to be on top of. So a bit of a checklist for you here. I really recommend getting a pay point progression checklist. So very simple to do on someone's anniversary that you can go through and determine whether or not someone should progress through the pay points, and then correspondence to confirm that, because that transparent flow of information is what's going to stop a lot of conflict then and there with the employee questioning their entitlements. Of course, we can support you with that one as well. It's a bit of a day-to-day job for us, pretty straightforward. What I want to look at now is around paying and structuring compliant salaries. So it's something that we do quite a lot. What's interesting is to think about the difference between a salary and a flat rate. Not much, to be perfectly honest. The salary is what we would consider that kind of yearly figure, so that per annum figure. The flat rate, however, is usually in that currency of an hourly rate. But regardless, and look, I am guilty of using the term synonymously, both a salary and a flat rate, what we find is they're usually designed to encompass an employee's total pay. So not just their ordinary hourly rates, but those relevant allowances, those weird and wonderful allowances we see under the SCHADS award, which we'll look at shortly. Maybe things like penalty rates, annual leave loading, shift loading, and overtime that might be payable under the award. So while I do love a good salary arrangement, you know, it can help to reduce a lot of administrative burden on a week to week or payroll cycle basis. It becomes really easy to set and forget and accidentally underpay someone using these sorts of methods. So when it comes to the question of, can I pay my admin or my management team a salary or a flat rate under the SCHADS award? You can. I do want to put a big but there though, because there's a difference between doing it and doing it compliantly. So yes, you can pay a salary. However, it's really important you're regularly conducting what we call a boot calculation. Better off overall test, just something derived from Fair Work to tell us that we use this calculation to work out that the salary that they're on is going to have them be better off overall than what they would have gotten should they have just received all of their award entitlements. What is absolutely necessary if we are looking at salaried workers, so if you do have any people on a salary, please note this on your to-do list to check. You must have a contract of employment that has an offset clause. If not, it may as well not be a salary and they will still be entitled to all of those rates and award entitlements. So we need to have a really strong and robust offset clause. And I'm not talking one sentence, I'm talking a fully developed, legally compliant clause there. We want to make sure that we've done our boot calculations and that we can demonstrate that compliance. For me, it's a nice, simple spreadsheet that I like getting into. And reviewing this process annually, especially when we've got our upcoming end of financial year wage rate increases, to make sure that that salary is still going to be compliant as new rates of pay come through. What I will say as well is generally speaking, salaries are designed to have those offset clauses apply within a pay period, as opposed to what we consider globally or offsetting annually. So you need to be really clear and understand, is the intention for my contract and the intention for this salary to be able to offset any entitlements that accrue within a particular pay period or over a yearly basis? If we're starting to look at that kind of global or annual offset, we may actually need to be getting a little bit more creative to ensure compliance by looking at an IFA that will allow us to vary the terms of the award to offset in such a way. Okay, so it's very important that we have that documentation down, because in lieu of that, the employee may make a claim and actually be entitled to the back payment of particular rates that you didn't intend on ever applying to their employment. In terms of what you need to know to summarise SCHADS award salaries, the SCHADS award specifically does not allow or have provisions for what we call annualised salary arrangements, which I think upwards of about 80 odd modern awards do have in place now. So what that means is you'd be entering it under a common law salary and applying the award to those provisions as well. If you're entering into a salary arrangement, you still need to track hours worked. We'll talk about this in a little while as well, but keep in mind the underpayment risks and statute of limitation go back 6 years. Our record keeping obligations around timesheets, rosters, time recordings, etc., go back 7 years in accordance with the Fair Work Act. So at any given point, if someone's going to question their pay, you need to be able to find for the last 7 years when they started and stopped work, and have that be very clear. So even though they're on a salary, you need to track those hours worked. There was a really interesting case that came across the commission recently where an employer didn't have that, because they had an apprentice that worked their 38 hours, it was the 9 to 5 or whatever it might be, that meant that they didn't feel a need to track start and finish times. The employee, however, kept a journal, and that journal contained when they started and finished their shifts. So when that employee later made an underpayment claim, the employer had no records to defend it, and the judge actually took that diary as being the appropriate start and finish times of which to calculate back pay from. So it is really important for you to have your version of events down and documented and systemized. Now, when it comes to creating and paying someone a salary, if they're covered under the SCHADS award, they're covered under the SCHADS award. Don't care how much you pay them, the award still applies. There is an option when an employee is being paid over $175,000 per annum. You could look at a guarantee of annual earnings. You still need to go through that award coverage process and have your documentation in place to have that apply. Now, for the scenario on screen, let's apply our knowledge here. We've got Alex. He's a team leader in our NDIS business. He's on a salary of 90K. Pretty good to me. His contract states that it's intended to offset penalty rates, overtime, and allowances under the award. However, what we see his regular roster to include is weekend work, overtime, working over 10-hour shifts, and broken shifts. Pardon me, with an element of travel there as well. So is his salary compliant? And what could go wrong if he challenges his pay? Is his salary compliant? I don't know. The salary does appear to be high, but in order to work it out, we need to do that boot calculation. We need to get the dollars and cents. We need to look at his roster, his timesheet, and his payslip. And that will show us and be able to do the calculations of what did you get on your salary versus what would you have gotten if you were under the award. That is the only way we can answer that question around whether that salary is compliant. I want to be double checking his contract as well, because I know we've got an intention of an offset clause. Will it hold up in court? We need to analyze the wording of that to make sure that it's going to be as waterproof and watertight as possible to support your initiatives there. I also want to know, what are we doing with annual leave loading? The award does have some weird and wonderful clauses around how annual leave loading is paid, and it does actually differentiate between shift workers and day workers as well. So Alex working regularly on the weekend, this could be an impact as well, and we'll look at that quantum of leave shortly. In terms of what could go wrong, the employer would essentially, be left to defend an underpayment claim. So this is again the importance of records, to be able to show when did he start and finish, where are his documents, to ensure that you have been compliant, that we don't face back pay or fines for non-compliance in the first place. So recapping that, so what, if you will, as I said, those underpayments can accumulate quite quickly, and that back pay does stretch for a 6-year statute of limitations. For your checklist today, check your offset clauses in your employment contracts. Get us to check them if you're not sure. If we don't have an IFA in place to vary the terms of the award as to how we're paying that salary, that too can be a big risk. And we'll look at those IFAs shortly as well. Where we are at the moment when it comes to audits and wage theft, businesses are left needing to prove that those employees are better off overall. So we can no longer take a backseat to this, especially when people are getting jail time for wage theft. Really important that we keep this in mind. IFAs. Okay, this one here is probably one of my favorite clauses in the award, so bear with me while I nerd out with you on this. So IFAs is an acronym essentially for an individual flexibility agreement, and we see that at clause 7 of the award. So you can see a little copy-paste snippet of the award there on your screen. Also feel free to research yourself. Pardon me. The reason why I love this clause is because it's very prescriptive. And I find when I'm supporting clients, I always go back to this clause to use it as a bit of a checklist to make sure that we are being compliant under the award. A few key FAQs I get when it comes to IFAs and understanding them. I get asked when we can use them. So IFAs are really good to use to vary certain award terms. So what you see at clause 7.1 tells us what terms we can vary. So arrangements for when work is performed, overtime rates, penalty rates, allowances, or annual leave loading. So what that means, if you've decided, as an example, you want to pay someone a salary and don't want to pay them annual leave loading, we need an IFA that's going to tell us that we are looking to vary that annual leave loading clause for this particular employee, how it's paid, how they're better off overall. Okay, People equally like to do this, say you are paying a flat rate for a sleepover, which includes the designated allowance under clause 25.7, as well as an hour of night disturbances. For that, you are varying the way the award is applied. Therefore, you need an IFA in order to be compliant. Can you give an IFA to a new employee? Quite frankly, no, but what is a new employee? Okay. So employees must have commenced employment with you. So they must have at least worked their first shift before you look at an IFA. So an IFA is in addition to and on top of an employment contract. It does not replace it. It does not supersede it. Okay. It is specifically about how you are varying the terms of the award for the individual. I recently saw a really interesting case around the enforcement of IFAs with the Commonwealth Bank. Now they had a big boo-boo there, and they were giving out IFAs to vary the terms of their enterprise agreement. At the same time, they were giving employment contracts to people who were being onboarded prior to commencement. Now, when tested, those IFAs were deemed unenforceable, and that left CommBank with an over $5 million back pay, simply because they gave it out on the wrong date. Okay, so really important that we're following clause 7 when implementing IFAs. In terms of whether I can give an IFA to all support workers, I'll point out the name again, individual flexibility agreement. So what I hear there is the intention of that clause is not to be applied company-wide to a particular shift structure that 40 support workers do. That's not the intention of this clause, okay? It's designed to be looked at on an individual case-by-case basis in something that is going to leave that worker better off overall, which we must demonstrate in this process and in that document as well. So for me, if you're going, oh, okay, I need an IFA to cover this particular shift on my roster, I think there's better ways to achieve what you need to there. So think a more efficient strategy like a roster audit, or looking at how shifts are structured, or even a company-wide EA to make sure that we're demonstrating compliance in a way that's right for your organization. IFAs bulletproof for compliance? Quite frankly, no. There's no guarantee until they're tested at the commission, but they do go a very long way to demonstrate that intention of compliance and agreement. And it feels a hell of a lot better to have that in place than nothing if you're wandering down there to defend yourself. In terms of how often you should review IFAs, for me, this is really regularly. Obviously, I'm HR, I love my documents. I'd love to see it done every 3 to 6 months. Absolute maximum time frame, 6 to 12 months. I'll give you for those that don't love paperwork as much as me. There is no particular or prescripted time frame of when they should be reviewed, but I would say regularly to ensure that they're not going to end up being unenforceable or in breach of that boot requirement. Okay, let's move on to a few of these weird and wonderful allowances that we see pop up under the award. So one that I find really interesting is that the clothing and equipment allowances that pop up between clauses 20.2, 20.3, and 20.4 of the award. What I see quite regularly happen in this industry is that you might not want your frontline support workers wearing uniforms. It might be a barrier to connection, a barrier to community, and that's perfectly fine. But we need to be aware of what are our obligations for not providing uniforms, for not washing someone's clothes for them, for those clothes if they get soiled, ruined, ripped, damaged on shift, which can happen based on the nature of the supports that they're providing. I would highly recommend putting on your to-do list today to be going through those clauses. So again, 20.2, 20.3, 20.4, to make sure that you're paying them correctly. I always like to go back to the source of the award when I'm preparing any advice for my clients. And even for today's webinar, having a read through those sub-clauses specifically. And one I found really interesting that I see a lot of confusion on is this uniform allowance And the fact that that is explicitly said that must be paid on paid leave, excluding particular absences that may go beyond 21 days. Now, that is such a specific compliance provision that you wouldn't expect to see. Why am I paying allowances for clothes that they're not wearing because they're not working? It's really important, again, that you feel comfortable with how that's being systemized and applied to your workforce to avoid both overpayments and underpayments. Oh, sorry, I've gone too far on then. First aid allowance. So this is another one that gets a lot of people talking. And here we're looking specifically at clause 20.6 of the award. So I quite often get asked here if all support workers need to be paid this allowance. My answer would be not necessarily, and it depends, which is very confusing and annoying. I appreciate that. The key takeouts here for me is that just because you have a first aid certificate does not automatically entitle you to a first aid allowance, okay? I appreciate that in this sector of caring for people, you may list that as an inherent requirement of employment, and that may be required under your NDIS or other governing models. Whether or not someone actually gets that allowance is going to depend on whether providing first aid is going to be an inherent duty that the in-person is responsible for in any given week. There is actually a difference as to how that allowance is applied between home care staff and SACS staff. So again, a really good reason to have those classifications nailed. For home care, we acknowledge the fact that those personal care duties might often mean, dressing wounds and attending to matters that might be deemed first aid. So for our home care employees, it's only if they have a certificate and they are required to provide first aid to other employees that they would get the allowance. For our SACS employees, however, it's talking about having the certificate and being required to perform it in their workplace. So whether their workplace be the office where our admin and leadership team is, whether the workplace is a SIL or STA property that you run, there's a bit more of a broad definition there, yeah? So really important that we feel comfortable and confident in how that's applying to business. Travel allowances and when is travel payable? So I do find there's a lot of confusion around this. I think to summarize what clause 20.7 around travel, transport and fares is trying to tell us is that this reimbursement of 99 cents per kilometre, which you can bet is going to go up at the end of financial year. So mark that in your diaries as well. That reimbursement per kilometre is required when you're driving your personal vehicle, not only to transport a client, so if you're taking a client out on errands, but actually driving between clients within a shift. So excluding broken shifts, but if I have a morning shift that I need to go from participant A to participant B, that is both travel time and kilometres reimbursed as well. When I'm travelling for work on an excursion, all costs need to be covered. So this is things like airport, flights, Ubers, taxis, accommodation, meals. If I'm going to a theme park, covering the entry for that, etc. So it's really important, again, that we have our recording practices in place. And I think policy as well to let people know when these allowances are and are not being paid so that we don't have any confusion or unreasonable expectation from our employees as well. Now, I want to look specifically at broken shifts and when we're paying travel, because that's a little bit of a different scenario here. So what I have on the screen here is an example of someone who is performing home care duties from 6 a.m. till 10 a.m. They're visiting a few clients during this time and then working from 6 p.m. till 9 p.m. What you can see there on the screen is when travel is payable and not payable. So again, driving between our participants is covered. That's paid travel time and kilometres reimbursement. However, to get from home to the start of shift one, to get from the end of shift one to wherever I end up, back to the commencement of shift two is not paid travel. Equally, when I finish shift two, not paid travel. Another really interesting thing that comes up for broken shifts, as a good example, is this idea of what penalties are OTE or what penalties are OT. So a couple of confusing acronyms then. OTA, I'm talking payroll, I'm talking ordinary time earnings. OT, I'm talking your overtime. Okay, so there's all sorts of different weird and wonderful payments that apply under the SCHADS award. We need to make sure that they're systemized and set up correctly, so that we're not overpaying or underpaying someone. So as an example, what is an OTE is things like Saturday penalty rates, Sunday penalty rates, public holiday penalty rates, afternoon night shift loadings, broken shift penalty rates, which we'll talk about in a second. That is differentiated from overtime. So and overtime itself, how that's calculated will be different per stream, SACS versus home care, okay? The reason why this is really interesting is because when it comes to OTE versus OT, things like superannuation, leave loading, there's these tax implications as to how we categorize each one. So as an example, your OTE will have superannuation apply, will have leave accruals and things like that apply, whereas overtime does not. So if we look at the wording for broken shifts under clause 25.6, it tells us when we're doing a broken shift that goes over a span of 12 hours, we're paying that at double time. Now, double time here is not overtime. It is a penalty payment that is OTE. Now, that's really important because if you are to just manually in your system go, oh, double time, OT times 2 and have that there, what you're going to essentially be doing is underpaying superannuation, potentially underpaying leave accruals as to how that shift is calculated there as well. So very important that you're comfortable with how that's set up in your system to accrue correctly. Other things that we see pop up here around payroll is that quantum of leave. So I've got the relevant clauses on the screen to look at here around what is a shift worker for the purposes of the quantum of leave, being accruing an extra week's annual leave for our permanent employees, versus a shift worker for the purposes of payroll that's accruing getting afternoon night shift penalties and rates accordingly. What I think is so interesting is that you can be a shift worker for the definition of one, but not the other, because they are different definitions and they sit separate. So as an example, if I have an employee that works Monday to Thursday nights, 6 till 11 p.m., you could comfortably define them as a shift worker. They would receive their shift loadings for those particular shifts. But they will never meet the definition of a shift worker for the purposes of quantum of leave. So in terms of how we know which shift workers in our system are entitled to annual leave, extra week, it's not as simple as going, right, shift worker tick. It would be at their anniversary to actually look at whether or not they've met this definition around the hours completed on weekends or completed the requirement of those 24-hour shifts. So really key takeout that they are differentiated for different purposes here. I want to touch on as well, oh my gosh, I've just realized how far over time I'm going, Emma. I'm sorry, I'm nerding out so bad here. Okay, I'll try and quickly get through this information now. Rostered days off and sleepovers. So what you can see is a graphic on the screen around a regular shift for a support worker that is a sleepover. I hope at this point, looking on the screen, you've all flagged that that shift on the screen is non-compliant. Okay, you'd remember back to our SCHADS Basics webinar, the sleepover needs to have a sleepover period of 8 hours and a minimum engagement on one side of the other of 4 hours. So the fact that that shift is 10 hours in length is one big red flag for me, and I hope it was for you too. What we see here, looking at clause 25.3, is the idea of having rostered days off, and that language there of 2 full days. Now, again, this is something that we have liaised personally with the Fair Work Ombudsman on to ask for their interpretation of what is 2 full days. We had quite a robust debate within our team of, is 2 full days 48 hours or is it 2 full days, Wednesday and Thursday? Now the Fair Work Ombudsman definition here is 2 full days being Wednesday and Thursday. So in this example, when someone is finishing work at 8 a.m. On that particular morning, it's not enough to roster them 48 hours later, because we're not going to meet that requirement of 2 days off, because they've started on that day. It's actually a few days later on the Friday where they would have fully had that Wednesday and Thursday off. Okay. Client cancellations and shift changes. This is something we see pop up a lot and is governed by clause 25.f of the award. Now, specifically, it does not apply to casuals. The big takeout here, okay, is different rules there. You've got options, not super practical options, but you've got options as an employer. We've got options to redirect the employee to complete other work during that shift time, to cancel the shift and pay for it, or look at doing makeup time. Now, these options are only applicable if we are having it cancelled by the client, so not for any other reason, and that we know the makeup time at least 12 hours prior to the cancellation. So this clause as well, clause 25.f, is very prescriptive as to how that works. I would say take the time to read through it to make sure you're comfortable with it. Reach out with any questions, because it is something that does pop up regularly, to make sure that you're rostering compliantly for. For me as well, I like to have the expectations around cancellation set in a rostering policy, so that employees, I see a lot of the time, because the clause in the award does not necessarily align with how the NDIS billing model works around cancellations. And so employees have this automatic sense of entitlement that because you can bill the time, they should be paid for the time. The two are differentiated, and I think that's really important to set an expectation for in a policy, which is something we absolutely can help with as well. Oh, I am so sorry, Emma. I have run out of time nerding out. Look, 24-hour care shifts. This one for me is quite a rare shift. Okay, it's around being available for duty in a client's home for 24 hours, but only working 8 hours during that time. Everything else is going to be at overtime. We have a shift loading that applies here, and we cannot have back-to-back 24-hour care shifts. So I have seen a lot of people use 24-hour shifts incorrectly. It can't be used on an excursion. It can't be used on STA. It needs to be in a client's home. So there are key takeouts there. I promise one last slide, Emma. Let me nerd out a little bit longer. Excursions. This is probably the trickiest one we see come up, and one that we are quite regularly in touch with the Fair Work Ombudsman on, to make sure that we are interpreting correctly. So what we see in the clause of the award that's quite interesting is that when you're on an excursion, we are flipping the ordinary hours of work on its head. We're no longer 6 till 8, we are 8 till 6. Even if we're a shift worker, outside 8 till 6, outside 10 hours of work, it's straight up overtime. We need to pay a sleepover allowance, but only on a Monday to Friday. Figure that one out. Not super common sense, but that is what the award is saying here. And we need to be conscious of how the actual sleepover is going to interact with the excursion. Can we apply it? Can we not? It's quite an area of contention there at the moment. Look, Emma, I am so sorry I've gone over. I will hand back to you, and we will jump into a Q&A very shortly.
Amazing. Thank you, Corinne. Gosh, time really does fly in a webinar, that's for sure. We've had lots of questions pop through already. So we bring it all back to what we call the so what factor. Compliance with the SCHADS award, it's not just about box ticking, it's very much essential to running a successful risk-free business. Too often we see businesses only act after a problem arises, but taking a proactive approach really helps avoid costly mistakes. Starting with classifications and pay point analysis, as Corinne mentioned earlier, if employees are misclassified or they're not progressing correctly, it can lead to serious compliance issues and risk of underpayments, which can be expensive because Fair Work has a back date of up to 6 years for underpayment claims. Next, reviewing of employment contracts. Key questions to ask are your contracts robust? Are they appropriately tailored to the award? We've had some questions pop through in the chat, and things that we would recommend to include in a contract is the agreement to work up to 10 ordinary hours per shift, or 8-hour rest breaks after sleepovers. The award permits these, but subject to agreement with the employee. Your HR policy handbook should be more than just general rules. It really needs to reflect your culture, your industry, give clear expectations and consistency. And the handbook should be reviewed and updated at least every 6 months. Policies are one of those things that sometimes get put on the back burner, but the legislation is constantly changing, and you should be updating your policies to reflect those changes. PDs, position descriptions, should align with the award. They should be clear, tailored, set expectations, drive accountability, avoid confusion. Audits, cannot emphasize the importance of undertaking these, doing things like roster audits, leave audits, payroll audits. They uncover errors and mistakes early, and they help you avoid penalties and non-compliance, which is particularly important in light of the new wage theft legislation that came into effect on the 1st of January. By addressing these areas proactively, your classifications, your contracts, policies, doing audits and having systems ultimately will minimize risk, boost compliance, and set your business up for long-term success. Now, before we go into Q&A, just a quick reminder about how we support businesses moving forward. For those of you who are new to Effective HR or need a bit of a refresher, we're a HR and IR consulting, and we help businesses across Australia with everything from HR, IR, payroll, and work health and safety. And we have a specialization in the SCHADS award. And then we offer 2 key services, which is our HR on demand, which gives you access to a dedicated consultant, and you have their direct phone and email contact for consistent personalized support. The HR on demand service, it operates on a pay per hour model. So you can use the service as much as needed, providing you with that utmost flexibility. And then we have our HR partner service, which provides ongoing integrated support with a structure across a 12-month period. The partner service, what that includes is unlimited access to advice with a dedicated advisor of your choosing, Fair Work Commission representation, HRIS platform, and all your essential documents, so your contracts, policies, and PDs. And then what really sets the service apart is our deep expertise in the SCHADS award. We're not just HR advisors, we're SCHADS specialists, so we don't react to just compliance challenges. Our goal is to help you stay ahead of them. And then we offer that on 3 levels, which is essentials, advanced, and complete. And that just allows for a level of support that best fits your business and budget. So we'll open up the floor now to questions. We've already had a couple come through. If we don't get around to your questions this afternoon, or if there is a question that you would prefer to have answered on a one-to-one setting, just click on the QR code and you can organize a meeting with the HR consultants. But we'll get straight into questions now because there's a lot to cover. Now, Corinne, the first question that we had was around our travel and having an understanding about what is the gap between shifts before travel is not paid. And I know this is a really complicated area, and when does it get paid? When does it not? Is there a certain time frame that we need to take into consideration?
Yeah, really good question. And what we see here, Emma, is really important to look at the intersecting and also separating the differences between our breaks clause at clause 27 and our broken shift clause at clause 25. Because how we determine whether travel is payable or not, it actually is based on what that shift structure looks like. So if we are essentially traveling in a continuous shift, we may have a meal break apply. So they may travel from participant A to participant B and then have a 30-minute meal break. In that situation, you would be looking at paying travel time and kilometers, and then that break period is unpaid, okay, before commencing participant number 2 there. What you then see happen is to go, well, at what point does that length of break become broken shift? What's annoying is the award does not define the length of a broken shift. There's nothing in the award that says a broken shift can't be 5 minutes in length. Technically, there's nothing there. What there is, and what we reverse engineer, is in our breaks clause. We know that a break is between 30 and 60 minutes. So what you quite often see is that systems providers in this space will have it set up that essentially after 61 minutes, it's considered a broken shift and will pay the broken shift allowance and categorize the shift as such. Now, that's not to say you have to do it. The advice I give clients here is to look holistically at the shift and go, was it genuinely a broken shift, or are you just trying to pay the cheaper of the two? So looking holistically at did the employee actually, step away from work for the day and then come back for round two? Like you might quite often see, say, chefs do for lunch service and dinner service, or, was it just a quick kind of 10 minutes between clients? So looking at the intention of the day more holistically tells us, do we best categorize these things as breaks or broken shifts in accordance with the award?
Amazing. Great answer, Corinne. Now, we've had lots of questions.
Sorry, Emma, I was just going to say, we do have that question. No, that's okay. We have that question pop up all the time. And so what we ask is that our clients send us through the particular scenario and we will tell you. I will actually go, right, it should be this or it should be that. But with so many variables on a call with so many different providers, I just want to be cautious to go, well, this is what we need to look at to find the answer.
And that's really important to raise as well, because advice should always be specific to your business, because every business is different in terms of how you set up your structure, what you've put into your contracts. It all needs to be taken into account. Now, we've had questions around client cancellations. Now, we know in the industry that the dominant engagement is casual workforce. Now, if we have a client cancellation, and the worker is a casual, do we need to pay for that full shift? And what happens if the employee refuses to be redirected? Do we still have to pay them in that circumstance?
Oh, that to me is symptomatic of a more holistic issue with our workforce. Let's start there in that sense of entitlement. But for me, when it comes to casuals, the legislation is quite silent on it, okay? We know that if they're ready to commence work and that commence work, we have a minimum shift engagement most of the time for 2 hours, 3 hours if we're SACS and not disability services, okay? So we would need to be meeting the minimum shift engagement, but not necessarily the whole shift. There's nothing in the award that tells us the amount of notice we need to provide. But this is where I start looking strategically with my clients, is to go, well, what works for the business that also will keep the workforce happy. So for me, I like to go, okay, if we've gotten ready and we've put our uniform on and we're in the car going to work, let's acknowledge that and pay that minimum engagement. Let's again have this sort of information in a policy that says, what are you going to get in that situation, that we are going to redirect. So I might get you to do some training or some cleaning during that time as an alternate duty, and that can be considered a reasonable management action as our policies and as our position descriptions define. Unfortunately, the game we play at the moment is, if it's not in writing, good luck deeming it reasonable. Which is incredibly frustrating. I appreciate that we're no longer looking at common sense and the hard work ethic, but it's the game we're playing and we do the best practically within those parameters.
Amazing. Thanks, Corinne. Now, we've had a question around overtime. So how many overtime hours are we allowed to provide a casual employee after they complete a 10-hour ordinary shift? How do you determine those rates? And can you negotiate a rate and have it covered under their employment contract?
Oh, there's a lot to unpack in that, Emma. Okay, so what do we pay the casual that's working over 10 hours a day? Firstly, go check clause 28, because that tells us specifically how to calculate time and a half, double time, etc., casual loading, all contained within clause 28. In terms of how many overtime hours you can do, there's nothing particularly in the award that caps overtime. However, there's a few kind of intersecting points I'd be looking at. Firstly, making sure that someone's getting their 10-hour break between shifts, if they are working an extensive amount of overtime. Secondly, the work health and safety and fatigue concerns in such a heavy role like frontline support to be working such extensive hours. And I'd also be looking at the NES, so that National Employment Standards, which is contained within the Fair Work Act that will apply to almost everyone on this call. That talks about maximum weekly working hours capped at 38 plus reasonable additional. It does have a dozen or so criteria of how to determine if those additional hours are reasonable. So I would be looking at essentially going through that checklist to determine, are those requests reasonable, and what do our documentation that underpins that say. So that's a lot of information. I'm not sure if I've answered those questions, Emma.
No, I think that was a good answer. We might wrap up with one more question because I know we're very close to time. And it was just regarding the point around OTE versus OT. I know it's an area that there can be a lot of confusion around in terms of when it applies. And we know it can have major implications in terms of leave accruals and super. So specifically when we look at broken shifts, the OTE versus OT, if somebody has rostered 3 broken shifts, and then they're going into another shift. When we're going over that 12-hour span, just to clarify, are we at OT or OTE?
Yeah, so when we've got our broken shift that's going over 12 hours, so this is our 25.6 subsection F, it is OTE. So it is actually ordinary time earnings paid at that 200 or double time penalty payment as opposed to overtime. However, if you're doing a broken shift but have worked more than 8 ordinary hours or 10 by mutual agreement in writing, within that broken shift, then potentially OT is going to kick in first. So it's very much a case by case. And again, we have a whole systems and audit division whose role is calculating how to pay certain shifts. So that's something we can definitely provide more specific advice on.
Amazing. Thanks, Corinne. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you found the advanced session gave you some clarity and the tools to make you feel more confident in managing the SCHADS award. If we didn't get round to your question, or if you'd like to get some further clarity around how we support businesses, looking forward to having a one-on-one session with you later this week. Thank you.
Amazing stuff. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.